before we invite our panel to speak, I just wanted to invite you to put your hands up in a minute. I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions. And I suppose the first question is, relates to this idea of, so what does it mean for public engagement to be embedded? Let me give you my sense of what I think that would mean. I think if public engagement was embedded in research culture, it would be a routine consideration for everybody who is involved in research. Just as, for instance, research ethics, everybody has to think about research ethics. Everybody has to make decisions about how they will accommodate ethics into their practice. So that would be absolutely true of public engagement. It's routinely considered as a really significant decision and a set of choices you need to make and think through in terms of how you approach your research. And the second thing I'd say is that, as well as that, if you decided that public engagement was therefore a really significant aspect and part of the research that you then wanted to carry out, you could secure resources, support, encouragement, and you would get recognition for doing so. So for me, that would be public engagement embedded in research. So my question to you, first of all, is that true? Is that the case? Currently, is that how you feel about public engagement in your practice? So anybody who would like to say yes, that is actually how it feels to try and do public engagement. There's a hand. There's a little hand that's kind of creeping up. Anyone else? Okay, so I think that does sort of prove the point that this debate is worth having. My second question to you is, do you think it should be, actually? Do you think that state that I just described, of it being a routine consideration in how we approach research, and if it is decided that it should be invested in, that you get that support? Could you put your hands up if you think that that is a state that would be worth trying to get to? Okay, good. So there is a debate to be had. Excellent. So without any further ado, Sarah, could you provoke us to think about this question?
I will do my best, Paul. Clearly I'm going to fall well short of the Dr. Strangelove reference, which can't be topped. My name's Sarah Whatmore, and although I was introduced as head of the Social Sciences Division, I'm actually going to speak in my capacity as a social scientist who, for many years, because I work at the interface of the multiple translations between environmental science and public policy making, has always been more intrigued than most, and certainly before the term PER was even invented, in what that knotty term public actually means, and in getting to grips with it, in working with it, in creating new kinds of publics, and trying to make sure that voices amongst the multiple publics out there that don't usually get heard or engage with research do so. Why? Because it makes my research better. It's quite as simple as that. So let me just start then with a couple of remarks about the framing of the session. For me, of course, Paul will present this as a great journey towards a desirable outcome in which we are all, in his words, routinely thinking about public engagement when we're designing and conducting research projects in exactly the same way that we do around ethics, consent, and so on. Yes, we hear your voice too. I suppose for my money, and I'll explain why in a bit, and this is going to be my provocative statement, I think there is a danger with this language around embedding, that actually we take that journey too far. Because I think that the pressures from research councils and others to build this in, from doctoral training to anyone getting a grant of any description, etc., does come with some potential negatives. My concern would be that, in my view, if public engagement with research is not genuinely integral to a research project, doing it as an add-on because you have to, in order to get a grant or in order to be somebody in receipt of a doctoral training grant, could be actually a negative rather than a positive. And for me, the counterbalance, if you like, to all those encouragements, inducements, call them what you will, from the funders of research, for this to be a much more systematic part of how people engage, do their research. The counterbalance for me is to reiterate one of Ian's opening remarks, which is that this is never going to be for everyone. It has to genuinely make a difference to, a constructive contribution to, the way that a piece of research or a research project is framed, if it's going to do a positive job. And secondly, even for those, in which I count myself, for whom public engagement is very decidedly makes a positive contribution to the kinds of research that I do and the ways that I do it, sometimes I need to be let off. I don't have to do it every day of the week, every year of my career. As Ian was saying, there are rhythms to this if it's to be a positive thing. So I think part of the embedding agenda, particularly the part that is about embedding it in workload planning and in the kinds of career development support and advice that we have, is great. As long as it doesn't become one of those boxes on a form, which if there's a blank in it in your annual review, becomes a negative. Mm-hmm. So these things cut both ways. Right, on to the more positive notes. So I think there are many variants on a theme of public engagement. For me, that spectrum is most readily defined by thinking about two ends of the spectrum. Are you thinking about public engagement where the engaged public is in effect an audience for the research that you've done, and at the other end of the spectrum, or are you thinking about public engagement where those publics are actually collaborators in the design and conduct of the research? Those are very different models. There is no value judgment applied across that spectrum. Both are equally valid models. They apply differently, perhaps, in different domains of research, although I think most domains of research probably could muster very good examples at either end of the spectrum. And then, of course, as ever, most of the activity that goes on under the label of public engagement is in the grey area between those two extremes. I operate very much at the collaboration end of that spectrum, as it happens, because, as I say, of what I do in terms of research. And so the lessons that I'm going to draw, or the pointers that I'm going to make, provocations that I'm going to make, derive from working at that end of the spectrum. So, first of all, I've got three little points to make. The first one is, as I think I've already intimated, I think that crucial to making a judgment about whether public engagement in whatever form is genuinely going to make a positive contribution to your research when you're thinking about designing it and or in the process of conducting it, is how integral is it? Did you build it in at the start? Did you have to go through a process of thinking through what could this add? If so, how best could it be added? And in adding it, what are the additional responsibilities that I'm taking on by working with whichever the public group is that you've identified? So is it integral to the research design? Is it going to help you deliver that project better or differently? My second sort of rule of thumb is that the best public engagement, I suppose here I have by definition made a value judgment, is in my view experimental. That is to say, of course, there are more and more tools as more and more people do forms of public engagement. Nonetheless, there really isn't an off-the-peg toolkit. And actually doing public engagement well, particularly in this way where it's integrated into research design and conduct from the start, I think almost inevitably means that we're all trying to invent. We're trying to be inventive or experimental of new forms of research methodology and design that enable us to do this element better. By definition, experimental means we need to be allowed for some of these public engagement activities not to produce a gold star winning outcome. That is the very definition of experimental. Some things work and some things don't. And then we need to get better at passing along, at, if you like, routinizing or at least recording some of those experiments that we've run and the things that worked and the things that didn't work, and how, if we did it again or if somebody else was to have another go, what they might do differently that could turn an initial failure into something more successful. And my third rule of thumb is ethical. One of the responsibilities that comes with doing public engagement in the ways that I've described, particularly in whatever shape or form as a genuinely integral part of a research project or a piece of research, is that one takes on responsibilities for people beyond those that are employed in your institution, perhaps working on the project, collaborators within the academy working on the project. They mean that you need also to take responsibility, whether you do the audience version or the collaborative version, of your responsibilities towards the publics that you've engaged. And that means a whole series of things, from ensuring that consent processes are really robustly done right from the start, the point of engagement, right through to making sure that some of the deliverables from a project, including who has a claim on the right to deliver them, need to be extended beyond the usual company of academics with whom we are used to collaborate. And that, again, can be challenging, and it needs to be thought through carefully from the start. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Sarah. I wondered just if I could turn back to the framing of the debate, which was public engagement embedded as part of research culture and practice. Potential reality or pipe dream? What would you say?
So I think that my opening statement really was my answer to that, which is that I think there's also a nightmare scenario, which is that it becomes a requirement, it becomes mandatory. Yeah. Everyone must do it. If they don't, there's going to be a blank on their annual review. I think that would be a really unfortunate direction of travel. And that's just the reverse side of the same coin that says, for those for whom this makes sense in their research, for whom they think it will improve the research that they do and the impact that it has, to make sure that work routines, workloads make allowance for those for whom this makes sense. So they're two sides of the same coin.
Thank you. Just a couple of minutes for you to talk to your neighbours about what you've made of Sarah. Has she done a good job convincing you? Yeah? We're going to have questions later, but before I invite our next speaker, just a couple of minutes just to react and to talk about the ideas so far. Over to you. Cut you short, but we've got a lot to get through. So I'm now going to invite our second speaker to stoke the debate even further. So Jack is going to talk to us his perspective on the debate question.
Thanks, Paul. Is this thing working? So, hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me here to Oxford. I am going to try to extend some of the things that Sarah was saying and try to get us to develop some sort of clarity of purpose. So if we're talking about public engagement, whether we can get the practice embedded in universities, my question will be, what do we think we're doing when we're embedding that? So as well as the how, I'm going to ask us to think about the why. My first provocation is that I think science has a democracy problem. I think right now, a few of us in the academy are looking at the world around us, and we may use words like post-truth, and we may worry about the nature of expertise and facts in our society. I think worrying about that is to choose the convenient thing to worry about rather than the inconvenient thing to worry about. And I think it misunderstands the nature of science. So my first contention, coming from a Department of Science and Technology Studies, is that science is about more than that. Science is a project not just of fact-making, but also of world-making. It is implicated in the futures that will be created, and therefore, when we're talking about the role that democracy might play in science, we should ask the same questions of science that we ask of any other project of world-making. Who benefits? Who decides? Who's in charge? What happens when things go wrong? Okay, those are essentially democratic questions. They're inconvenient ones to discuss within universities. Here are some things that we've told ourselves about public engagement in universities. We have told ourselves that, as Paul said at the start, we have moved from a situation of ivory towers speaking down paternalistically to citizens, right? A sort of monologue model. We've moved from that to a dialogue in which we're having conversations. But for people like me that have been observing and taking part and fighting for and occasionally organizing those sorts of dialogues, often those conversations look like the worst sort of conversations that we've all had at dinner parties, where there's a lot of talking and not very much listening. And often the reason for that is because there is no clarity of purpose about why those conversations are happening. So there's a lot of concern about how public engagement should take place. That discussion normally trumps the discussion of why we think we're doing this. Now, there are multiple reasons why we might want to engage the public. We might want to increase public support for scientific research. We might want to get more children to study sciences at school. Those are laudable ambitions, but they are very different from a more radical democratic ambition that I'm interested in, which is how to better ensure that science and technology are aligned with what people need. That's a different thing, and it leads to some different types of practice and some different strategic objectives. Let me just end with an example, just because it's at the front of my mind at the moment, assuming that I've provoked you a little bit. So at my university, just as at lots of big science-heavy universities, we are having a lot of discussions right now about artificial intelligence. I'm being dragged into discussions about AI from government, from NGOs, as well as from researchers. And people, when they have that discussion about AI, they often start by saying we need to learn the mistakes of the past, we need to make sure that the very poor conversation that took place around, for example, agricultural biotechnology, genetically modified crops, is not allowed to take place around artificial intelligence. But when push comes to shove, those same sorts of assumptions and the same priorities resurface in that discussion. AI is clearly scientifically extremely interesting, and one can imagine why university scientists are interested. One can imagine why companies are really interested. It's commercially extremely exciting. One can imagine why certain parts of government would like to support those ideas. But my question is, who's speaking up for public value in that discussion? I'm not going to suggest that AI will produce a doomsday machine. Indeed, I think actually the sort of doomsday scenarios of AI, as a wonderful researcher called Kate Crawford has described it, are themselves a reflection of the fact that at the moment that debate is being controlled by some very powerful people. If you are Elon Musk, if you are Mark Zuckerberg, then fine, it's okay to talk about the robots taking over, perhaps creating hordes of unemployed people who will rise up and stage a revolution. For everybody else, there might be more immediate concerns, but those concerns about who's going to benefit from AI, what might AI look like if it was to benefit poor people rather than rich people, those concerns systematically get forgotten. So this is why we need to democratize that discussion, not pretend that we know all of the issues. I'm going to leave it there, unless, Paul, I should just address your question. Okay. So is public engagement a pipe dream or a reality? And I think the point is, and let me just riff on Sarah's absolutely correct critique. So public engagement is taking place in interesting ways in pockets of universities, often in places that have learnt the hard way what happens when public engagement goes wrong. So those places that have had crises over, say, biotechnology, or crises over data leaks, for example, are those places that are most likely to open themselves up to these sorts of discussions. But the presumption, I think, should not be that this is for individual researchers necessarily to do. Right? Why are we presuming, when we're talking about embedding, that this is about saying every funded researcher must tick a box on a form, every funded researcher must come up with a plan? Because there is a pattern within institutionalized science of actually devolving responsibility down to the individual scientist. And scientists are nice people. They're responsible people. So on the whole, they take that on. But that allows funders, it allows universities, it allows departments, and those other levels to abdicate their own responsibilities. So when we're talking about embedding, let's not presume that we know who it is that should be doing the embedding. And I'll end there.
Right, I'll just give you a couple of minutes to react. Brilliant, Jack, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Our final speaker, before we move into a question and answer session is Ben.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me at the back? Okay. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak. As Ian said, I'm the head of the Department of Zoology here in Oxford. So I'm here representing the perspective of a head of department. And one of the things you have to do as head of department is manage many people's relationships to their work, the science, the education that they're doing as university employees. Now, I feel I should, in a sense, say that public engagement is actually something that I'm very proud of my department's record in. It's something that we celebrate, something that we promote, and there will be a point to what I'm about to do towards the end, but I wanted just, in a sense, to illustrate the diversity of the kinds of things that we do departmentally that come into the sort of the public engagement sphere. So someone's already mentioned the Curiosity Carnival. We were very involved in that. We've won VC Public Engagement Awards within the university. Got a very wide range of media, science communication outputs coming out of the department. So, for example, I guess about a quarter of the science news stories on the university website come from my department. We've got extremely active YouTubers among the graduate students, so people with tens of thousands of followers. We've supported their activities. We have everything from that up to people involved in national broadcasts. So, for example, a couple of programs fronted by David Attenborough this year that used research from my department, people doing full sessions on the Life Scientific, this sort of thing. Other types of public engagement activities as well, of course. So we support, for example, 4 NERC Knowledge Exchange Fellows within the department. We have people who've been very involved in working on the interface between science and policy, for example, in areas such as the question about whether badgers should be culled in relation to TB, how we manage trophy hunting of charismatic fauna in Africa, how we deal with emergent infectious diseases, what we do with changing agricultural practices and what that means for the quality of our food. So a very wide range of activities within my department. We've also, in the past year and a half, appointed a dedicated outreach and communications officer, Caitlin Hamilton, who's here in the audience today. So I should say I feel slightly, having been asked to take the sort of the skeptic role, I just want to say that I am very proud of my department's role in that. But I want to reflect on some of the things that Jack and Sarah have said and how there's a challenge as a head of department to think about how you build those into a department. So the question is really about whether we're trying to embed this or whether it's something that actually is already there. So as a head of department, one of my challenges is that I have people who have many demands on their time. So as academics, we're expected to be world-leading researchers, innovators, teachers, administrators, mentors, to provide broad leadership in our fields as well. And those are all in areas where there's tremendous pace of change at the moment. The research landscape in the UK is changing incredibly rapidly, not just with the effects of Brexit, but also with the changes in the organisation of research from the top down. Our relationship to our students, the way in which we educate them, is also changing. It's a thing we have to be addressing all the time as well. So, of course, the problem for me is how I can enable people to be effectively engaged with the public while also having to manage all of those demands as well. So how is it that I am to manage if someone says to me, look, I'd like to do this, and I'd like to do this, and I'd like to do this, and I'd like to do this, but I'm also being asked to do this, and this, and this, and this. Can you help me make that decision and manage my time? And I think it's very hard to actually understand, particularly with public engagement, sometimes how much that demand is. How do we sort of think about what the demand is for an individual? I'd also like to be a little bit more provocative and say that we're talking about this in the realm of science, and several people have said that no one questions whether public engagement actually is an effective way to improve the science that we do. And I would like, in a sense, just to be provocative and ask, well, what evidence do we actually have that it is an effective way to improve the science and the way that we're answering relevant questions? If we look at some of the major scientific revolutions in the Earth's, in human history, did those occur at times when public engagement was an active activity among scientists? And finally, in a sense, I think I'd like to ask the question of whether actually this is a debate about something that we really don't need to do very much about. So the reason I listed all of the things that my department does and has been doing for the past decade or so is that I think much of that has emerged really from the bottom up without the need to actually worry about a strategic plan for public engagement. These are just things that, as Jack said, most scientists are responsible people who are interested in talking about their ideas to as wide a community as possible. And those who have the proclivities and the abilities to do that find those outlets. So is this really something that we need to worry about setting a particular agenda for and worrying about the extent to which it is embedded? So thank you.
Thank you, Ben. It's sort of interesting, isn't it? I've never particularly liked the term embedding. I've always struggled with it. I've always tried my best to think about it in the sense of making public engagement feel sort of deeply integrated and integral to research. But I can't help, a wicked little genie in my head can't help thinking about getting into bed when I hear embedding. And I think what you've done today is just make that even harder for me, because I now have this awful dystopian vision of public engagement as a giant duvet kind of floating down onto the higher education sector, stifling creativity, forcing people into box ticking and mindless compliance. So thank you.
Anytime.
I don't know whether I'm ever going to be able to get rid of the duvet of public engagement, which is not what I suspect anybody in this room would like to see. I think you've given us a tremendous set of kind of crunchy things to think about. But thank you for being such a wonderful audience and a brilliant panel, and onwards and upwards.
It remains for me, I think, just to thank the panel for their insights and for giving us a new sense of what it means to be in a confusing environment where many things are required and lots of things are unspecified. And thank you, Paul, for your able sharing and drawing out of these various themes. I think if we can get to a point where it's legitimized, it's recognized, and it's supported but not required, that's appropriate for a system which is an ecosystem for discovery, where lots of things end up coming up in unexpected ways, and you need to be in a position to capture what can be captured and run with it. So thank you, everybody, for your time and insights today.